Before I get started on the presentation, I'm going to go ahead and just at least turn on and say hi so you know what I look like for those of you that haven't seen me before. So this is me. And with that, I won't take up any more bandwidth with the camera on. So wanted to thank, first of all, Victoria for the opportunity here to be able to share this. This is an ongoing effort to really make sure that people understand the TTP formula. Been doing this for about 2 years now, developing presentations, presenting all over the country. And this is the second time where I have fine-tuned the presentation to specifically one venue. I guess 3 months ago, I went and visited with the Navajo Nation, and I adapted the presentation just for the Navajo Nation, and that went over really well. So when I was at NTICC about a month and a half ago, Victoria approached me asking if I could do an Alaska edition, which I thought was intriguing. And so you're going to see for the very first time how the formula looks specifically just to Alaska. There's going to be some things that are simplified, some things that are more complicated. So just want to let you know that I am here not just to present this, but to answer your questions. So I think Victoria has set up a question and answers pod to use. You can write questions in there. I'll also pause very regularly if you want to raise your hand and ask a question, because the point is to help you guys understand, not just to present it. So definitely want you to feel free to that. This next slide is the slide that has by far the most words of any of the slides I'll be showing you. And it's just to explain what we're doing here. For those that aren't aware, in the 23 United States Code, Section 202 is the Tribal Transportation Program, and as part of that is the formula in that legal reference there. And I'm going to go through kind of a visual representation of what's in the formula as it's described in the law. And I'll even have some math in there that uses numbers that are kind of typical for tribes in Alaska. So you're going to see what kind of the average tribe in the that's in the Alaska region, the numbers that look like. So if your numbers are more than this, you're above average. If your numbers are below this, you're lower than the average. But this is kind of the average for Alaska that you'll be seeing throughout this presentation. So we're going to start out with this one big orange circle that represents all the money for a year in the TTP. And we're basically just going to break this circle up into a bunch of pieces to show you where all the money goes. So you can envision this is like the year, and then we're going to break it up. So the first thing that happens when we break up the TTP funding is we have what are tribal shares and we have what are set-asides. Set-asides, the term set-aside is a legal term. It means that the law designates that before you do anything else, you have to set aside some money. So that's what the set-aside means. The set-asides in the Tribal Transportation Program are planning, high priority projects, safety, and then the program management and oversight, which is the funding that BIA and FHWA use to administer the program. I will point out that the high priority projects program is primarily primarily accessed by tribes in Alaska. It's not exclusive to tribes in Alaska, but like last year we had, I can't remember how many awards we had, and all but one of them were to Alaska. So that set aside does end up, in fact, all of these except for the PM&O, the program management and oversight, the planning, HPP, and safety also all go to tribes. They're just not part of tribal shares. And then tribal shares is made up of really 5 pieces, but the law breaks them into 3 pieces and then breaks part B into 3 more pieces. So I'll be explaining each one of these pieces, including the 3 parts that part B is broken into, which are mileage, population, and region. Now the letters A, B, and C, that's not accidental. That is actually the legal references. Part A of the formula, where it describes it in section 202. Part A is what I'm going to call transition funding. It doesn't actually have a name, but for simplicity, we call it transition funding. Part B, which is the actual technical, legal, codified formula, that's where it has the mileage, population, region share. It's Part B, and then Part C is supplemental. Those are legal references, so not just A, B, and C because we wanted to make them up. That's actually where it is in the law. But because they are A, B, and C, it does make it really convenient because A plus B plus C is how you calculate your tribal shares for a tribe. You add Part A, you add Part B, and you add Part C for each tribe, and you get the tribal shares for that tribe. And I'll just point out, because I always like to point out, we've been going at this for about 5 minutes now, and you have the most important information in front of you right now. If you understand this slide by the end of what we're doing today, you have understood enough of the formula to be dangerous. We're going to go into more detail, but just understand that this is what the formula looks like. So there's 4 set-asides that are broken out of the formula before we start calculating tribal shares. And then tribal shares consist of 3 pieces, but Part B is 3 pieces as well. So, so if you understand this, then you are set. The rest is just going to be bonus points from here on out. So the first thing I will talk about is just show you how the set-asides break out, how much money goes into each of those set-asides. And we're gonna, for all of the examples here, except for when we actually get into real detailed numbers, we're just gonna kind of pretend a fiscal year that has $600 million for the whole TTP program. Last year, the amount was 602 million. This year, fiscal year 25, which just started 17 days ago, fiscal year 25, the total for the program is 612 million, 612 and a half million, really. So we're using numbers that are pretty typical. When we get to the specifics to Alaska, I actually am using 2024's numbers. But for the rest of this, for just the examples, we're going to assume a year that has $600 million. So 2% planning, you'll hear the term 2% planning tossed around. The reason why it's called 2% planning is because it's a 2% set aside from the total. You have 9 million that are set aside for the high priority projects. You have 4% of the whole program set aside for safety projects. That's the program that Adam Larson, if you've met with or know Adam, he manages that. The high priority projects are managed by Blaine Kunihisa. And then our planner is Dana Rinke. So we have people that are assigned to each one of those circles you see on your screen. And then the 5% for program management and oversight. And again, that's shared between the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Federal Highway Administration to administer the program. All right, so here's that $600 million that I was telling you about. In a $600 million year, the planning is just 2% of that, so that's 12 million. The high priority projects is always 9 million. The law says 9 million. It's not a percentage, it's just a number. So it will be 9 million every year. 4% of the 600 million is 24 million, and 5% of the 600 million is 30 million. And if you add all those up for that year, the total set aside would be $75 million. That's just the 4 of those numbers added together. It's important to know that because the rest is going to go into tribal shares. So I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to pause here and just ask you, knowing that there's 75 million that get set aside, and you can type this in the chat, how much goes into tribal shares if we set aside 75 million? Yes, I'm actually making you think here and do some math. So this is also a test to see if everybody knows where the chat pod is and everything. Oh, chat is disabled. Okay. Did not know that. Then never mind. If you can't type in the chat,
shouldn't be.
then...
Hang on a second. Let me see if I can. All right. Use the Q&A pod because I didn't think chat was disabled, but I will.
Okay, so yeah, so type it in the Q&A pod for now, and I'll be able to
check.
see who gets the answers in. All right, I see one correct answer. Okay, I see. Okay, good. We're I'll give Victoria the benefit of the doubt for missing a few zeros. But yeah, 525 million is actually how much would be left over to be able to apply to tribal shares. All right, so good job. Everyone's math skills succeeded for the day. That's one of the few times I'll actually make you do the math, but the first part we're going to talk about that isn't set-asides is the transition funding. So the transition funding, the reason why it's called transition funding, again, that's not the legal name. There is no legal name for it. But the reason why we call it transition funding is because in 2012, the law that established this formula was created in the MAP 21 authorization, if you've heard of that, if you've been around for a while. When that law was created, part of it recognized that we're going from a formula to another formula, it's a completely different formula than what was used prior to that with the Indian Reservation Roads program. And so recognizing that there would be a dramatic change between the two formulas, they instituted a 4-year transition period from primarily using numbers that would be similar to the Indian Reservation Roads program to then using the new formula. So in 2011, which is all the numbers, a lot of the numbers we're talking about are going to be based on the numbers in 2011. There were two pieces. There was the relative need distribution factor, which was actually the name of the IRR formula. And then the IRR formula had a population adjustment factor, which was a smaller piece of the pie. But together, those made up what the tribal shares were in 2011. And the first year that we were to use the formula, it was passed in 2012. The first year we used the formula was in 2013. And it said for 2013, to make the transition happen, the bulk of tribal shares would be just 80% of what the 2011 amounts were. So you had 80% of the 2011 amount plus B and C, which were a lot smaller. And then each year from then on, Part A gets smaller. So in 2014, Part A was 60% of what the 2011 amount was. So you still had a big portion was Part A, but you then Part B and C got a little bigger. In 2015, it went to Part A was 40% of the 2011 amounts. And then in 2016, it went down and stayed at Part A is 20% of the amount a tribe received in 2011. So that number never changes. So if you have your amount of funding you received in 2011 from the IRR formula, you can figure out Part A. It's just 20% of that number. And it'll stay that way. The law freezes it at the 20% amount. So as an example, if you had a tribe that received about 200,000, excuse me, in 2011, then that tribe would receive 40,000 in transition funding in this basically all the time because it's always 20% of that. So that's the first number. So you got Part A for this tribe, which is fictional, but represents kind of the typical amounts in Alaska. I think the actual average for 2011 in Alaska was 250 something thousand, but I just took the first digit and ignored all the rest of them. So 200,000 is a little lower than the average. So any questions up to this point, either on the set-asides or on transition? Because those are two pretty basic math situations, just a percentage of a whole number. I just want to make sure that there's no questions about those. Not necessarily asking about how you do HPP or how you do safety, but just how the math works.
Either raise your hand or post in the Q&A. As far as I can tell, the chat's not disabled on my side for anybody, but if you have trouble with the chat, the Q&A pod is definitely working.
And I am not seeing any hands shooting up. I'll keep an eye on the question and answers, the Q&As, if something pops up. But I'm going to move on to Part B. Oh, transition. Can I define transition? Yes. So this is for Dan. What we mean by transition is we're making a gradual change between what we had in 2011 and the new formula. So there was a slow transition from 2013 to 2016 to get people used to the new formula from the amounts they were getting in the old formula. Because the old formula was completely different, so the calculations would have been completely different, which naturally means that tribes are not going to get the same amount out of the two formulas. It would never work out that way. And so it was a chance to adjust and kind of temper that to make it a little easier to move from one formula to another. And again, I'll just emphasize a piece of that transition still exists in the formula today. So that 20% is part of the formula. It never goes away. All right, part B. So there's three pieces to part B, and so you have part B, 27% of that is based off of eligible road mileage in the National Tribal Transportation Facility inventory. So the NTTFI, 27% of part B comes from miles in the inventory. 39% is based off of population in NAHASDA, so the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act. The numbers that we use for population aren't really representative of population. They're representative of NAHASDA's data for housing. But that's what's used in that 39% for population shares. And then the last 34% of the formula is based off of an equal distribution between the regions. So each region gets an equal 12th of that 34%, and then it's divided among the tribes in the region. Not evenly, it's divided on based on how much they were receiving in the IRR formula, the period back from 2005 to 2011. And I'm going to go more in detail on each one of them, so you don't have to remember all of that right now. Just for now, understand that mileage is 27%, population is 39%, and region is 34%. And each tribe will receive a piece from each of these pieces. So there will be a mileage piece, a population piece, and a region piece for every tribe. In Alaska, there are some tribes that the NAHASDA data has 0 as the population. And so in those cases, the population shares piece of that village's shares would be 0 because the population would be 0. And so if you have a 0 in any of the categories, then that piece will be 0. Otherwise, there will be some amount based off of either mileage, population, or history. And again, like I said, it's ratio based. The formula is all ratios. So you're taking percentages of percentages is how the formula works. So if you didn't like percentages when you were in middle school, unfortunately, this formula is loaded with them. So that's the reality of it. You're taking ratios of percentages. So with that, here's an example of kind of how we calculate how much is available to distribute in each of these pieces. It's important to understand that even though B comes before C in the alphabet, in the formula, the calculation of the formula, the amount that goes into B is the last thing you figure out. So you figure out all the safety, all the set-asides, you figure out all the set-asides, you figure out part A, you figure out part C, take all of those out, and whatever's left is what goes into part B. So for example, in this 600 million year that we've been creating, we already said the set-asides would be 75 million, and that would leave 525 million. And then the part A, the transition, the amount, like I said, is frozen in time. It's based off of 2011. So that number is never going to change. It's actually 69,400,000 something. But for the sake of round numbers, we're just going to pretend like it's 70 million. And that number stays constant. That number won't change. So we take 70 million out of that 525 we were dealing with. And then, even though we haven't talked about it yet, just so you know, supplemental comes out first. And for this kind of year of 600 million, it would be about 125 million that comes out in supplemental funding, which leaves about 330 million to distribute in Part B. And the way that you distribute Part B, once you figure out Part B is 330 million, all we do from there is we just multiply those percentages, the 27%, the 39%, the 34%. We multiply each of them by the 330 million. And so you'd get these numbers. So mileage shares would end up being 89.1 million. Population shares would end up being 128.7 million. And the region shares would end up being 112.2 million. And then you'll see as soon that these are the exact numbers in this year. For the next sections, again, I'm going to round them. So we're going to deal with 90 million for mileage, 130 million for population, and 110 million for region shares, just to keep the math simple. So first of all, mileage. When you're calculating tribal shares, there's a lot of different facilities that can be in the NTTFI, but the only ones that actually generate money in the formula are roads that were included in the BIA system inventory prior to the start of fiscal year 25, so October 1st, 2004. A lot of roads in Alaska fit this category, and that's actually one of the reasons why this category is included. The only two states that are allowed to have any miles in this #1 category are Alaska and Oklahoma. Those are the only two states that have any roads in that first category. And then we also have those that are owned by tribes and those facilities that are owned by the BIA. Those are the only three types of roads that can generate money in the formula. So state roads, county roads, municipal roads, all those things, unless, like I said, it fits category 1, those are not included in the formula. They're still eligible to do work on with TTP funds, but they don't generate money in shares. And to add to the fun, it's only facilities that meet those categories that were in the inventory in 2012. So the law freezes it at 2012. So whatever the inventory was in 2012, that's what is feeding into the formula today. And the way we find out an individual tribe's shares is we just take the number of miles for the tribe, divided by the total of all the eligible miles that fit those three categories, and get a ratio, and then multiply that by the total available for mileage shares. So as an example, the total eligible mileage in the NTTFI, just so you know, it's 60,446.3 miles or 443.6 miles. I can't remember which one's the last decimal. I should check that. But we're just going to round it to 60,000. And then it worked out when I was looking at the numbers, conveniently, the average tribe in Alaska has 60 eligible miles. It was actually, I think the number was like, it was like right by 60. It was like either 61 or 59. I don't remember the exact number, but it was super close to 60, which makes the math really easy when you divide 60 by 60,000. You just get 1,000th or 0.001. So what we do, that's a really small number, right? 0.1%. So this tribe is going to get 0.1% of all the money that's available for mileage shares. And these ratios are always really small numbers, just so you know. So again, we have 0.001. Like I said, we have about 90 million was in the mileage shares. If we multiply 90 million by 1,000th, we get 90,000. So this tribe's share for mileage would be 90,000. And I see a question from Daniel Burke. How would you recommend a tribe requests to increase their population? All right, so the formula spreadsheet was low for a couple of tribes. All right, there is, and I'm going to talk about, I'm getting the population next, but there is a way to appeal the NAHASDA numbers. So I will point you to that when we get to that part of the presentation. There is a way to appeal it, but those numbers are estimates as calculated by HUD. Before I move on for mileage, though, are there any questions specific to the mileage piece of the formula? And again, you can raise your hand if you want to, and Victoria can unmute you if you want to ask it over with your microphone, or you can type it in the Q&A. All right, not seeing any, so we'll proceed on to the population piece that I told you was coming. So the population shares, it's the same idea, 39% of Part B, and it's based on the ratios of the recent tribal population data computed in NAHASDA. So unlike the mileage, right? The mileage I told you was frozen in 2012. The population data is the most current that's available when we run the formula. So that means we usually run the formula in the second quarter, basically between January and March of the year. NAHASDA publishes their data for each year in early October. So, for example, and I haven't actually checked to make sure, so I hope that they've done this, but the 2024 data should have just been posted by HUD for the NAHASDA data. I haven't actually looked for it this year yet, but it should have just got posted because the 2024 data is what's going to be used in the 2025 the tribal shares formula, because we won't have the 2025 data available in January or March or whatever. But we will have the 2024 information, and just like the 2024 formula use the 2023 data and so on. It's always kind of the prior year's population data is what goes into the formula. Okay, so now how do you appeal it? And I'm going to tell you, I'm going to put, so there's a Google search that I do, which is how I find all this information, find the web page and everything. I just Google and I put it in the chat. Oh, I guess I need to send it to everybody. Let me, oh, that's what it is. The chat's just between us, Victoria. That's why it's not available to everybody else. It's just to host some panelists. So, okay. So I just Google IHBG data. So Indian Housing Block Grant is what the IHBG stands for.
Okay,
Data.
settings changed, so you should be able to chat to everybody now, Matt.
Ah, there we are. There we are. Okay, I'll type it again. So this is I don't have any page like bookmarked or anything. I just Google that because it's only 9 characters to type. So IHBG data, that's how you access the actual data. Like you can pull the population numbers. Also, just a little bit down from the top of the page is a section on how to appeal the data. It even says the deadlines, like how long you have to appeal the data. The data request for appeal has to be submitted by the end of March each year, and has to be finalized by the end of June each year. And that will affect the next year's shares, right? Because if you appealed in 2025, the 2025 information will affect the 2026 shares. Just want to check, Daniel Burke, if that answers your question that you were asking. That is the only way to change the numbers, is to appeal them through HUD. Or I mean, it's also based on what the tribe reports as their housing needs. So their available housing affects that as well. All right, perfect. Thank you.
Matt, do you know how HUD calculates those numbers? I mean, what data are they gathering to determine them?
So there's 2 answers to that question. They both kind of feed together. One of those answers is it's based off of what the tribe's housing office is reporting to HUD, right? So because there's an annual report due to HUD that it reports the AIAN numbers, the American Indian, American and Alaska Native numbers. So that's in there, and there's also the what is the survey? It used to be based off census data, but it moved to the American Communities. Oh, I forget the name of the survey. There's a survey that goes out to a sample of the population that works into the estimates. So it's kind of a give and take between those 2 numbers that determine HUD's numbers. All right, so let's do some math here. The idea is the same, right? We're going to find out what the tribe's population in NAHASDA is and compare it to the total for the whole nation, the whole AIAN population going into the formula. So again, this number actually ended up pretty close. The average the average NAHASDA population for Alaska is about 300. I think it was slightly less, but pretty close to 300. And then the total NAHASDA population, actually this year it was like 1.6 million, but the math looks prettier if we use 1.5 million, because it just ends up 0.0002. I guess if we did 1.6, it would probably be 0.00116 or something like that, which wouldn't be as nice. So again, really small ratios here, but they multiply by really big numbers, right? That's the important thing to understand. Like with this case, we're going to multiply that 0.002 by 130 million. So when you multiply those two numbers together, the tribe, this fictional average tribe in Alaska, the shares are 26,000 for just population. So just to really quickly review, so for this tribe, we've got 40,000 in transition funding, 90,000 for mileage shares, and 26,000 for population shares so far. Okay, I see in the chat, and again, yeah, okay, that I've heard that about the estimate and the inaccuracies of it. Like I've heard that reflected in several conversations. So Hillary, I agree, that's definitely a talking point. And something for tribes to address if the numbers are vastly not representing the need. That's something to pursue with HUD through appeals, through whatever it takes to address those. I will tell you, for the sake of the formula, FHWA and BIA are required to use the most recently published NAHASDA data. We have no flexibility on that because that's the requirement in law. So the influence to change those is not through FHWA or BIA. We can't change that, but if it does change, we'll happily incorporate it because we're required to. That's what the law specifies. Any other questions on population? And again, if you have a question, definitely prefer you put that in the Q&A rather than the chat. But commentary in the chat is very welcome. All right, I will move on then to the region shares piece. Now, I will say from this point forward, things get a little more complicated. Right now, it's just been kind of just distributing to tribes, distributing to tribes, distributing to tribes. From here on out, we start distributing to regions first, and then distributing to tribes. So there's one extra step from this point forward, starting with the region shares. The first thing that happens with the region shares, this 34%, like I said, it gets divided equally among each BIA region. So if I throw up a map of all of the regions, and yes, I am fully aware the Alaska region is not south of California. I hope that everybody in Alaska doesn't feel bad when the entire world keeps trying to put you in Mexico. Recognize the Alaska region, that's just where everybody always puts it. But what happens is we take that region shares piece, divide it into 12 separate pieces for each of the regions. So you can see in this case, every region gets the exact same amount. So the Navajo region, which has one tribe, gets that same amount that Alaska with 227 tribes gets. So that amount is distributed in equal portions to the regions. And depending on the number of tribes in the region, the amount that each individual tribe gets is vastly different. So once we know how much a region is getting, and again, the BIA region doesn't necessarily get this money, it's just that's how the money's divided, is based off of tribes located in the BIA region. So each tribe's going to have, the region's going to have an amount that gets divided, but it gets divided unequally based off of the funding that was received, like I said, when the IRR formula was being used between 2005 and 2011. So that piece is all based off of ancient history. So the more a tribe received during that time period from 2005 to 2011, the more of these region shares that tribe will get. And so we said we're going to round to 110 million, which gives each region about 9.2 million. And so then Alaska, on average, received pretty close to $50 million, the Alaska region, $50 million during the IRR formula. And remember, our fictional tribe is getting 200,000 in the 2011 period. So we're going to use those numbers as the ratio for this specific tribe. So the ratio is 200,000 over 50 million. So the ratio goes up. They get 0.004 this time. So the ratio is bigger than those other two ratios. But it's also a ratio of a smaller piece because we've already divided the region. We've divided everything into 12 pieces to start. So with that ratio of 0.004, the tribe would get the 9.2 million times 0.004. So the region piece of the tribal shares for this fictional tribe would be $36,800. And I'm tempted to ask you to then do the math and see if you're paying attention to figure out how much Part B is for this tribe. But I'm going to show it to you later anyway. But it's a little over 150,000, sorry. Little over 150,000 for Part B total. And I did this on purpose. I am not done with my presentation, but I am notorious for forgetting to include my contact information. So I deliberately inserted it in the middle so I would make sure you have my contact information. So you're welcome to save this slide. Victoria is going to make this whole presentation available after we finish the webinar. So we're not done, but I just want to make sure that you have that contact information. I am happy to talk about the formula. It's one of the principal things that I love talking about, mainly because nobody understands it. So it's my crusade to change that. I want people to understand it. So please email me if you want to call me. If you have questions, you want to understand for your specific tribe why your numbers are the way they are, I am happy to help you understand that. And with that, we're not going to take a break. We're going to move into Part C. And Part C is by far the most complicated piece. I have simplified it a lot for this presentation, mainly because we only have 20 minutes left. When I was in NTICC, we spent an hour and a half talking about just Part C. So it can get pretty complicated. I've tried to distill it down a little bit to make it not quite as complicated for the purpose of our discussion. But as I said, when we went to Part B, I said Part B gets all the leftovers. So before we can find out the total for Part B, we have to find out what Part C is. So the way we find out Part C, there's two pieces to it. The two pieces are 82.5 million. It takes 30% of the first 275 million. And then it takes 12% of everything that's available beyond 275 million. Not a big deal to understand that. For the purposes of this year of 600 million, we had the 82.5 million, and then we had an additional 40,625,000 that came out of that 12.5%. Most important thing there is just we calculate the Part C to be the combination of those two. So we're dealing with about 123,125,000 for Part C. And so now, like I said before, from here on out, we first distribute to the regions. And once we've distributed to regions, then we distribute to tribes. So here's how we distribute it to regions. And this is where things will get really interesting because you're going to see real numbers. You're going to see real comparisons between different regions as to how the formula works with each region. Because the distribution of the supplemental funding is based off the distribution of Part B in each region. So we have to calculate mileage and population of region shares for each region. So I'm just going to show you graphically how that breaks out. And these are real numbers. What you're seeing right here is a graph of real numbers. So for mileage, you can see that Alaska actually gets the most money out of the formula from mileage, with Navajo being the second most. And you can see other regions that get substantially less. With population, the distribution changes dramatically. So you can see that the regions that get the most in population are not the same that get the most in mileage. And the region shares doesn't affect that because all regions get the exact same amount of region shares. But what I want you to see is combine Part B together for all the regions, and you get this distribution. So this is how Part B distributes throughout each region. And so if you can't see it too easily visibly, you can see Alaska region as a whole gets the third most amount of money from the Part B of the formula after the Eastern Oklahoma and Navajo regions. And what we do to distribute the supplemental funding is each region just gets the same ratio. So Eastern Oklahoma is going to get the most of Part C, Navajo is going to second most, Alaska get third most, and so on. So the amounts that go to each region are less, but the proportion's the same. So that's how the supplemental funding gets distributed by region. And I'll show you the math here, so you can actually see real numbers. So for mileage, we had the 89.1 million. So I'm using real numbers now, based off of 2024 numbers. So you can see 19.2 million went to Alaska region from the 600 million just for mileage. When you get to population shares, you can see that the Alaska region, out of that 128.7 million, gets an additional 6.9 million for population based. And then every region then gets an equal share of, is actually 9.4 million here. And so Part B for everybody ends up looking like this with these numbers. So you can see Eastern Oklahoma gets 42.6 million, Navajo gets 41.2, the Alaska region is at 35.5, and the next highest is the Western region with 32.7. That's how Part B breaks out. That's how much goes into Part B for each of the regions. We're not talking tribes yet at this level. And so when we break out proportionally the supplemental funding, breaks out of the same ratios. So the Alaska region gets 10.7% of the 123,125,000, which means there's 13.2 million for supplemental funding. For the Alaska region, you can see the numbers, how they break out there. And again, you might not be able to look at all the numbers with the speed that I'm going through this, but you will have this presentation available to you if you want to delve into it. And again, I'm happy to answer questions if you have them. You can send me questions, you can call me. I love getting calls. I really do. So with that, that's the breakdown for each region. Once we know the numbers for each region, then we distribute to tribes in the region. So here's where you're going to see some pretty, with Alaska, with the number of tribes that are in the region, you're going to see what I think is a pretty stunning image in a few slides of how it breaks down for each of the tribes in Alaska. But the distribution inside the region, we have to first of all have calculated Part A and B, because the distribution of Part C depends on Part A and B. It's not proportional in this case. Now we're going to be comparing it to 2011 amounts. So we're going to figure out a number that's Part A plus B, and we're going to compare it to how much a tribe received in 2011. So we'll just have these two bars to represent that. Funding. We call them C1 and C2 because we're all a bunch of engineers around here. C1 is the part that a tribe would not be eligible for based on this logic of the 2011 amount being less than the A plus B. C1, if a tribe's A plus B is greater than their 2011 amount, their C1 amount will be 0. Conversely, if a tribe's 2011 amount is greater than what A plus B is, they will receive supplemental funding. So the way we figure out what part C1 looks like is we just compare the 2011 amount to A plus B. And you'll see we've got a little tiny sliver in this case that is the difference between the two of them. And that little tiny sliver we're going to call the delta. This isn't a legal term or anything like that. Some people use it, some people don't. The reason why it's called the delta, if you are an engineer, delta just means the difference. That's what delta means in engineer speak. So the difference is the delta. That's redundant, but that's what we call it. So this is how the deltas look like for the Alaska region. I want you to look at this for a minute and and in the chat, if you could just post your reaction to this. The X's, by the way, the red X's represent tribes that are not eligible for C1. They don't have a delta. So what is your reaction here? I want to know, because I know what my reaction was when I first did this, but I want to know what your reaction is. Yes, there's definitely a big range that goes from nothing to big, right? And keep in mind, each of those rectangles represents the difference for a tribe between what they got in 2011 and what A plus B are. So the bigger bars represent a bigger difference, meaning that that tribe's A plus B is substantially lower than their 2011 amount. And to add to the fun, this is a semi-geographical representation. So each of those colors I've shaded them in represent. So yeah, I agree, Hillary. Each of these colors represents essentially, if you go to the reservation codes, the BIA reservation codes, the 6 codes, whatever they're called. In Alaska, there's 5 groupings that are based off of the, make sure I get this right, the second digit. There's a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, and a 9. And they kind of are geographical. But I've kind of colored him in just by that because it's a lot to kind of take in. So essentially 1, which is the blue ones, that's basically the Aleutians, and then a little bit of the Southern Peninsula area. And so on each of them. And then the purple, these are the only ones that can clearly do the geographics. The purple or the pink, whatever it looks like to you off to the right, that's southeast Alaska. And because there's that number of bars in this, I couldn't possibly demonstrate for every tribe that we would be doing this for the next week. So for simplicity in the demonstration, I'm adding up all the deltas for each of those. So I've got them shaded in those 5 colors. So I'm now combining them into those 5 colors just to make the graphics a little more compact. So that's how each of those colored areas adds up. So you can see kind of the ratio of the deltas between them. Clearly the bars are a lot smaller too, but that's the proportions of each of those areas. So we said, that the total for Alaska is about 13 million. The deltas for Alaska are about 8 million. I'll show you the exact numbers when we get to the math. But what we do is we just compare overall. In this case, we add them all together and compare it to how much is available to Alaska to see if there's enough. And for Alaska, there is enough. We have enough that we can match all of those deltas. Okay. So what that means, what that translates to is that there's enough supplemental funding available to the Alaska region to get every tribe in Alaska up to their 2011 amount. That's what we're doing with part C1, is we're getting every tribe, if possible, up to their 2011 amount. And in Alaska, that is possible. There's actually plenty to do so. So what that means is part C1 takes every tribe in Alaska up to what they were getting in 2011. And then you'll see that there's a little extra piece. It's a little over 4 million. There's an extra piece that's left over after we get all of the tribes in Alaska up to 2011. Then what happens to that extra piece is every tribe in Alaska gets a piece of C2. That second part, whatever's left over from the supplemental, every tribe gets a piece of that. And they get a piece of it based off of how much their A plus B plus C1 is. So if a tribe has more A plus B plus C1, they'll get a little bigger piece of the C2 portion. And when you add the two pieces, C1 and C2 together, what you have left is the total amount of supplemental funding that goes. Now this is to each geographic area of Alaska, but you can pretend like consider it like a tribe. A tribe's C1 plus C2 equals their total supplemental funding. And I'll go through mathematically real quick just to show how that works for our fictional tribe. We have the A plus B, which these are the numbers for A plus B, which we already illustrated. We're going to add all those up together. Works out to be 192,800. We said their 2011 amount was 200,000, so there is a difference. This tribe is eligible for supplemental funding, albeit their delta is kind of small. Their delta is that 200,000 minus the 192,800, which is 7,200. So this tribe has a delta of 7,200. And we already spoiled it. I already told you there's enough. So they're going to get 7,200 from the supplemental portion, part one, C1, right? So the total deltas in Alaska are 8.2, almost 8.2 million. And as we said, I guess it's a little less than 13.2, 13,114,780. These are actual numbers from 2024. So what we do is, first of all, part C1 is going to be take that 8.2 million and distribute it out among all the tribes that had a delta in Alaska. So we got everybody to 2011, and then there's nearly 5 million to distribute to all of the tribes in Alaska. And so that's the general concept. I'm going to show you for this tribe, the 200,000 tribe, I'm going to show you how much of part C2 they would get. Part C1 would be 7,200 because everybody gets their full delta in C1. To get C2, we take the tribe's 200,000, divide it by the total A plus B in Alaska for 2024, which was 53.7 million. So they get a ratio of basically 0.37%. And then of that 0.37%, you multiply it by that nearly 5 million, the 4,932,000. So the tribes, this fictional tribe will get $18,937 in part C2. And you add it all together to find out how much this tribe gets in supplemental funding. So they would get 26,137. Now, that's a lot to take in. I don't expect you to really be a master now of supplemental funding. It's a lot to take in. It took me a long time to really feel comfortable with my understanding of the supplemental piece. So I'm not expecting you to do, but the important thing is to understand there's two pieces. One piece is trying to get every tribe to their 2011 amount, and then the other piece distributes whatever's left over after we get everybody their 2011 amount, if we do so. And that is the formula So all I'm going to do now is just do a wrap up to show you how it all adds together. Big picture. So again, I told you this slide, I already said this slide, if you understand this slide, you have all the knowledge that you need in order to understand the formula. But I'm going to take you one step further because we have calculated all of these pieces. We've already calculated the transition funding was 40,000, the mileage shares were 90,000, the population shares were 26,000, the region shares were 36,800, and the supplemental piece had the piece that was 7,200, which was the delta, and then the additional extra piece that was 18,937 for a total of 26,137. And if you just add all of those numbers together, you add part A, you add all three pieces of part B, which I told you I would not make you do that math because I was going to show it to you. Here's where I show it to you. The total is 152,800. And then we add part C, which was the 26,137. If you add all those two together, those three pieces together equal 218,937. And that would be the calculated shares for this tribe. However, there's something that happens, which I'm sure some of you are aware of because it can be an important point to discover. Even though the formula authorizes $218,937 for this tribe, the tribe actually gets $190,037, which is 86.8% of the authorized amount because of a thing which you may have heard of called obligation limitation. It's a requirement in the law each year that FHWA reduces the shares based off of an obligation limitation set in the law. So the obligation limitation is due to the way that FHWA is required to manage our overall program, the whole federal aid program. And it consists of two pieces, obligation limitation and August redistribution. We do not have time to talk about those today. But as a result of those, there's only 86.8% left to distribute for new funding. And so if you take 86.8% of our tribe's money, you get 190,037, which I will point out is less than the 200,000 they got in 2011, which is a situation that a lot of tribes in Alaska fall in. We get above the 2011 amount, and then the obligation limitation reduces the tribe's actual shares to less than their 2011 amount. So I wanted to bring up that point at the end here. And so I'll throw up my contact information one more time. This one means we actually are done. I managed to do that in an hour, but I'm sure you have questions. I am willing to stay on after the meeting's supposed to end now, but I'm willing to stay on to answer questions. Be happy to do so if you have questions.
We can keep going as long as people have questions. You can either raise your hand or post something in the Q&A box.
And if you want to pull an emoji that, you want to post an emoji in the chat that represents how you are feeling right now after seeing that, you are either overwhelmed, you feel like your brain has just been sucked dry, or you are stunned by the last thing I just brought up, you're welcome to do that too. Reactions are fun. Someone looks happy. I'll take it as happy. I'm happy too.
All right. Well, question. Well, people thanking you, Matt.
Just a thanks. You're welcome, Dan. Oh, and I will say this actually, for those of you that will be going to Alaska Providers, I'm actually going to be doing this same presentation again there in person. So you're welcome to come to that. I will say that it is a little easier to understand this when I'm face to face with everybody. But I think I'm getting pretty good at being able to explain it in all the different forums. But if you want to come and either attend it, it'll be part of the transportation track at Providers, or you can talk to me one-on-one. We are doing one-on-ones there. We're setting time all 3 days of Providers. at the Marriott, we're going to have a room set aside just for FHWA to meet with tribes. So you're welcome to set up something like that, or just catch me, just pull me off to the side. Hillary, are these funds automatically distributed to tribes, or do they have a plan for how the funds will be used? Okay, good question. There are 6 answers to your question, Hillary. And those 6 answers are based off of what is the transportation delivery method the tribe has. So the 6 delivery methods a tribe has, the 6 delivery methods, one of them is that the BIA does direct service, meaning that the BIA doesn't actually transfer the funds to the tribe at any point. The tribe asks the BIA to deliver. That's the historical default, right? That's how everything used to be with the BIA. The BIA did everything for tribes, right? So there's still a remnant of that exists, but it's a very small piece. We have a big chunk of tribes that deliver their transportation through self-determination contracting, 638 contracting. So in that case, the tribe would receive it through the contract. Both BIA and FHWA have program agreements. That's a substantially more flexible approach to delivering transportation, which allows either the agencies to transfer the funding up front to the tribes once it's available. And then the other 2 options are through self-governance. So on the Department of the Interior side, you can, as part of a self-governance compact with DOI, you can do transportation as a special project, or you can do a self-governance compact for transportation with the U.S. Department of Transportation. That's the newest of all the 6 versions, is the self-governance compact, and the number of tribes that are starting to do that is increasing pretty rapidly. So that's how the tribe would receive the funding. So depending on which one that is, it would determine whether or not they get it up front, or whether it's doled out by reimbursement, or whether it never actually goes because they're a direct service relationship. Hopefully that answered your question, Hillary. I saw your question disappeared, so.
Do you know whether your session at BA Providers that first week of December, is it going to be a breakout session, or are you going to be just part of the overall transportation session with the opportunity for separate meetings?
So my presentation at Providers is part of the transportation track. So it'll be one of the breakout sessions in the transportation track. But I will be there the entire time. So I will be available. I mean, I'm only going to be there for an hour and a half block, right? Or maybe less. I think maybe it's just an hour. But I'll be there the whole time. For the one-on-ones that I was describing, those will be going on the whole time, and tribes can we'll send out communication if you're interested in one of those one-on-ones. Actually, I don't, is Chris still on? Chris is not on anymore, but either Miles Brooks or Chris Riley, who are our 2 tribal coordinators in Alaska, they're setting up those one-on-ones. So if you let me know, I can inform them so they can give you the information. Okay, GeoRiftus, is that presentation happening at Providers? I haven't seen a draft agenda for the whole Providers, so I don't know. I don't know if GeoRiftus is on, if Sheldon's going to be there to talk about it or not. I'm not sure. I haven't seen the agenda yet.
Providers frequently does do at least something on Riftus at some point, so it's likely. But again, the BIA hasn't published an agenda yet. It's just it just recently went from hoping it's going to happen to confirming it will happen.
Exactly. Yes.
And I will also be at the BIA Providers Conference in Anchorage, and so I look forward to seeing you again, Matt. And I'm also available for answering questions. And so, on that note, if nobody else has questions, I'm going to stop recording. And
thanks for inviting me to join, Victoria.
And this webinar will be posted on YouTube later today, so feel free to let people know what they missed and tell them they can see it then.